Hello and welcome to the latest in our series of videos on Irish history. Today we'll be finishing off the Modern Ireland course by looking at Ireland from 1966 to the year 2000. And we'll be looking at it in a number of ways. So first of all, we'll be looking at what were the main events of Jack Lynch's first government. And we'll be looking at this under the headings of the EEC and the Arms Trial. Also, we'll be trying to answer questions like what economic problems did Ireland face in the 1970s, what problems did Ireland have with its governance in the 1980s, and how was Ireland governed in the 1990s? Let's begin and take a deep dive, shall we? So, the first thing is that we mentioned and remember from our last video was Jack Lynch. Jack Lynch was seen as part of that younger group that came through under Sean Lemass with Donogh O'Malley, who was seen as more in touch and more dynamic and open to change in Irish society. So much so that in 1966, Lynch succeeded Sean Lemass as Taoiseach. Lynch's greatest achievement was arguably to negotiate Ireland's entry into the EEC in 1973. Now, the EEC, the European Economic Community, was the EU. Agriculture benefited most from this, as farmers' incomes doubled between 1973 and 1978. This was due to the Common Agricultural Policy, the CAP, which gave grants to farmers to invest in modern farming methods and machinery. The CAP guaranteed high prices for farmers' produce. However, industry was unable to compete with foreign companies where tariffs were lowered. Many factories were forced to close. Ireland did benefit from EEC grants to improve roads and education. This laid the foundations for the economic boom of the 1990s with the Celtic Tiger, and money was also given to aid the poor regions such as the west of Ireland. However, Ireland also benefited from the Common Fisheries Policy, the CFP, which allowed Irish fishermen to also modernise the same way the CAP had done it for farmers. Now, the Arms Trial was the straw that would have break the camel's back eventually for the Fianna Fáil party and Jack Lynch. Violence broke out in Northern Ireland in 1969. Jack Lynch said in a famous TV statement that the south of Ireland could no longer stand idly by. And this was taken by some Republicans as Lynch promising to go to war in the north. Now, this again was not feasible for the Southern Irish Army to do this. They'd have been destroyed by the British Army. But what Lynch meant by this "we will no longer stand idly by" speech, which you can look up on YouTube, meant that the South would now do all it could to try and increase diplomatic measures and to try and improve and forward the civil rights movement in the North. This was the start of a sustained period of violence called the Troubles. Protestants attacked Catholic areas in Belfast, burnt their houses and drove them out. Some ministers wanted the Irish Army to intervene in the North, however Lynch refused as it would create a bloodbath. Now, Lynch sacked two of his ministers, Charles Haughey, on your left here, and Neil Blaney on your right. They were accused of using public money to import arms to the IRA. These arms were to be used by nationalists in the north to protect themselves. The ministers were tried for illegally importing the arms, but they were found not guilty, and they also were allowed back into the Fianna Fáil party. Now, this would come back to bite Lynch big time. What economic problems did Ireland face in the 1970s? And a lot of this comes about with Fine Gael and the end of Jack Lynch. Now, Fianna Fáil was defeated in the 1973 general election. The party had been in power for over 16 years and people wanted a change. Liam Cosgrave, son of WT, who we've seen before in our other videos, led the national coalition government of Fine Gael and the Labour Party. However, the Arab-Israeli war led to a worldwide oil crisis. Oil prices soared, which created huge economic problems such as inflation, which was the rise in price of goods and services, and unemployment. To cope with the crisis, the coalition government borrowed money from foreign banks. Ireland's foreign debt became bigger and more people were out of work. As a result of the failure of the coalition government to solve these problems, Fianna Fáil won the general election again in 1977. The new government increased spending, which boosted the economy and reduced unemployment. However, there was a second oil crisis again from 1978 to 1979. Charles Haughey took over from Lynch's Taoiseach as he failed to cut back government spending. This resulted in more borrowing, more inflation and more unemployment. Now, Ireland in the 1980s. There were still many changes in government in the 1980s, however, most of them were unsuccessful in dealing with the economic crisis. There was a major rise in unemployment, emigration and inflation. As a result, the government had to cut back on spending in areas such as health and education. Charles Haughey said as much in his famous "We Must Tighten Our Belt" speech, which again you can find quite easily on YouTube. In 1987, the new Fianna Fáil government, led by Charles Haughey, began to deal successfully, though, with the economic problems facing the country. The government, trade unions, and employers agreed a plan to help the economy develop. This was called social partnership. Workers were given tax cuts in return for low wage increases over the following 3 years. The government introduced very severe cutbacks in government spending. This was the beginning to the solution of Ireland's economic problems. Now, what you will also see here, and we'll take a quick trip away, is the issue of Northern Ireland, which was seen as a major issue for the Irish government, as there was constant pressure from the public to do something about the Troubles. This goes back to the Sunningdale Agreement of 1973. Talks were held between the British government, the Irish government, the Unionists, and the SDLP, who were the main nationalist party in Northern Ireland. In December 1973, an agreement was reached, and this was called the Sunningdale Agreement. This later collapsed, but it did show that there were efforts being made to contribute towards peace. The other thing that happened here in Northern Ireland was that the Troubles did continue with little sign of a solution. So, in 1985, the Taoiseach Garret FitzGerald and the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher concluded an agreement called the Anglo-Irish Agreement. And yes, there are many more of them, as we've seen before, but I will go into this in a later video. And now to Ireland in the 1990s. Peace was secured in Northern Ireland in 1998 with the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. You also had the Irish economy growing faster than any other economy in Western Europe from the mid-1990s onwards. In this period, Ireland became known as the Celtic Tiger. Major computer companies such as Intel and Hewlett-Packard were attracted to set up in Ireland. This investment was due to a well-educated workforce, low corporation tax, and the fact that Ireland was a member of the European Union. And what this did was it validated Lynch's decision to eventually go back into the EEC, which Ireland did in 1973. Thank you for listening. We'll talk to you again soon with another video. Goodbye.